Hello. Good evening, everyone. I am Rebecca Hernandez, the community archivist here at UC Santa Cruz. Joy Harjo is a renowned poet of the Muskogee Creek Nation in Oklahoma. She served as Poet Laureate of the United States from 2019 to 2022. This is her poem titled Eagle Poem. To pray you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all of this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born, and die soon within a true circle of motion. Like eagle rounding out the morning inside us, we pray that it will be done in beauty. For time immemorial, Indigenous people in what is now known as the United States have had a relationship with the land. The Creator set us in the perfect place and made clear that we were to love, honor, and learn all we could about it. This intimate understanding of place is at the center of all we do as a community. It is my privilege to share the land acknowledgement today. By doing so, we are reminded that the history of Indigenous people on this land did not begin with European contact. Long before that time, Native people cherished this land, our home, and are still intrinsically connected to it. I always hope that land acknowledgements provide a moment for us to reflect on the beauty of the place we enjoy as guests, and in this case, to appreciate all the Amah-Mitsin tribal band does to honor it. This land acknowledgement was written by members of the tribe with faculty and staff at UC Santa Cruz. It honors the Yupi, a tribe that has no living descendants, but remains their home nonetheless. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amah-Mitsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of Indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm Lori Kletzer. I'm the campus provost and executive vice chancellor here at UC Santa Cruz. Welcome this afternoon to the Corey Amphitheater. It is wonderful to be with you here this afternoon. There is no better place to be, in my mind, than here talking about reading with hundreds of people who have chosen to be here and who have a shared reading experience about climate change. I will have a bit more to say, but for now, I would like to introduce up to the podium Santa Cruz Mayor Fred Keeley.
Given that not one person here came to hear me speak, I will be brief. On behalf of my colleagues on the Santa Cruz City Council, This has been quite a literate and literary weekend. Last night, Kumba was filled as we honored Stephen Kessler as our Poet and Artist of the Year. And today, my goodness, having both Elizabeth Kolbert and Ezra Klein in our presence, we are a blessed community today. Today, I am issuing a proclamation which establishes today as Elizabeth Kolbert Day in the city of Santa Cruz, with all the privileges thereof. And tomorrow will be Ezra Klein Day in the city of Santa Cruz, with all the privileges thereof.
Thank you, Mayor Keeley. The Deep Read, the Humanities Institute's annual book program, is an important vehicle to connect people across our campus, the local community, and around the world. We all dive deeply into a book, think critically together about questions that matter to all of us, and look at those questions from all angles and all disciplines. This year, in Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, journalist and author Elizabeth Kolbert takes us on a journey into the complexities and intricacies of the climate crisis and how people have tried to undo the changes taking place on our planet. This is one of the most urgent issues of our time. While it was caused by human ingenuity and some hubris, it will require ingenuity and some humility to create a sustainable future. Across our campus, faculty, researchers, graduate and undergraduate students and staff are working together and with partners around the globe to understand how we all contribute to climate change, how we can change those habits and behaviors, and what can be done right now through research and innovation to slow the change and lessen the impact, particularly on historically marginalized and vulnerable communities around the world that are being impacted the most. I want to thank the Humanities Division and the Humanities Institute and all of my colleagues for bringing us together. The humanities play a central role in addressing today's most urgent questions by helping us understand our current strategies and circumstances in context, and how, in a more human way, how to make our way to a more just future. The power of the humanities lies in transforming lives for the better, creating engaged, empathetic, and informed members of our communities and our world. Under the leadership of Dean Jasmine Allender, the Humanities Division is dedicated to producing interdisciplinary research, student learning, and public programming in ways that break new ground and speak to the diverse array of communities and concerns. The Humanities Institute, under the direction of Faculty Director Sharon Kinoshita and Managing Director Irena Pollack, is a vital part of the Humanities Division and serves the whole campus. The Humanities Institute is a global hub where research and teaching, cross-disciplinary collaboration, and public engagement meet to address big ideas. Providing research opportunities is a key part of what the Institute does, and that goes hand in hand with engaging the broadest community possible in all of these important conversations. Through the Deep Read, the Humanities Institute has built a global community of people who come together to engage in a shared conversation every year. That community, now more than 8,000 strong, continues to grow year after year. And now I'd like to invite Jasmine Allender, Dean of the Humanities, to come to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CP EVC Kletzer. Good afternoon, Deep Readers. Wonderful to see you all here. As Lori just said, I'm Jasmine Allender. It's my honor and privilege to serve as Dean of Humanities at UC Santa Cruz. I want to reiterate Lori Kletzer's welcome to the culminating event of the 2023 Deep Read and extend my gratitude to Rebecca Hernandez, who is doing vital work as our campus's first community archivist. And my thanks to Mayor Keeley for joining us for the proclamation that he shared today. And when he came backstage, he said, free parking for Elizabeth Kolbert today and Ezra Klein tomorrow. So I feel like we could all take advantage of that. Send your tickets to Mayor Keeley. The Humanities Division at UC Santa Cruz is dedicated to transformative research, teaching, and learning. And as Elizabeth Kolbert's Under a White Sky makes clear, possibly a spoiler alert for those of you who are still reading, we will need more than scientific and technological solutionism to tackle climate change and build a just future. We also need contributions from the humanities and the arts, which are essential to any such future, or really any future at all. Deeply complex, seemingly intractable problems need interdisciplinary, innovative approaches. There are ideas that can only be conceived of and conveyed through the humanities, questions, debates, conversations about what it means to be human, to be alive, to work to transform society for the better. In the humanities, we reckon with our individual and shared pasts and engage in perspective-expanding conversations. And in the humanities at UC Santa Cruz, we're thinkers and doers, reimagining the world and fully engaged in our biggest challenges. I'm so grateful to be at an institution that values the liberal arts and the sciences, and I want to give a special shout out to my colleague, Dean Paul Koch, who is here somewhere today. There he is. Paul is Distinguished Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences and has served as Dean of Physical and Biological Sciences since 2011. He is returning to the faculty this summer. Paul, thank you for being such a wonderful leader, partner, collaborator, and mentor. The Deep Read is one of the signature programs of the Humanities Institute, otherwise known as THI. THI is housed in the Humanities Division, and it's a leader in developing enriching public-facing programming that demonstrates the vital role that the humanities play in forging communities that share deep and collective responsibilities for each other and for the world. Today's event is a culmination of a series of Deep Read events that's included guided discussions, salons led by campus faculty, a community message board, and a credit-bearing course for undergraduates. I want to thank the UCSC faculty from the arts, humanities, social sciences, and physical and biological sciences who participated in the faculty salon, Mike Beck, Jody Beal, Sakina Gina, and Georgie Mene Bajeto. I'd also like to reiterate the CPEVC's gratitude to the founders of the Deep Read, Sean Kylan and Irena Polic, as well as to Laura Martin, Adam Jacobson, Carrie Napolis, and Maya Rodriguez. And I want to thank our gracious alumni salon hosts, Mark Zemmelman and Steve Wagner. And thank you to our university events and Corey staff for supporting us coming together in this incredible, beautiful setting. Campus and community partnerships are key to the success of the Deep Read. We welcomed new partners this year, including Ecology Action and the Climate Coalition, and we welcomed back previous partners, including Santa Cruz High School and Pacific Collegiate School. This program benefits from the strong partnership we have with Bookshop Santa Cruz. Free public event Free public events like this are often made possible by the generous contributions of donors, and I want to add my sincere appreciation to the Helen and Will Webster Foundation for their support of the Deep Read, the Humanities Institute, and for helping me to realize a new vision for the Humanities Division at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you very much. It's an honor for me now to introduce Elizabeth Kolbert and Ezra Klein. Elizabeth Kolbert has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1999. She was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2015 for The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, a book about mass extinctions that weaves intellectual and natural history with reporting in the field. The book that is the focus of this year's Deep Read, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, is a national bestseller and was named one of the best books of the year by multiple publications, including the Washington Post, Time, Esquire, and the Smithsonian Magazine. Ezra Klein is an opinion columnist and podcast host at the New York Times. His podcast, The Ezra Klein Show, receives more than 500,000 downloads per episode and is routinely in the top 25 on Apple's charts. Prior to his work at the Times, Ezra founded Vox, And as Vox's editor-in-chief and then its editor-at-large, he helped create Explained on Netflix. In 2020, he published the book Why We're Polarized, a best-selling examination of the forces driving polarization and paralyzing politics in the United States. A few logistics before they come. There will be time after the conversation for audience questions. So please write your questions on the cards you should have been given when you came in. If you would like a card and a pencil, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will bring one to you. Also, I'd like you to know that this event is being recorded for archival purposes. With that, I invite Elizabeth and Ezra to take it away. Thank you all for coming.
Oh, it is so nice to be here. Literally here, the nicest place in the world. That also, unless I missed it, which was missed in my bio, where I went to college. I'm a Stevenson alum, so. And I always feel, whenever I'm at the Quarry for anything, that this is a disappointment, and this should really be hosting a Michael Franti concert. Anyway, it's a thrill to be here. Thank you all for having me, and to have me interview one of my favorite writers, Elizabeth Kolbert, and also for it to be this book, because when I was told this is going to be the book for the Deep Read, I actually thought that was a fairly courageous choice. You all read the book, right? Yeah? So, when I was here, which was a minute ago, but I've been in San Francisco for the past couple of years, I associated Santa Cruz environmentalism with a kind of conservationist strain in the environmental movement. A feeling that maybe there was a way to keep things as they were, right? Maybe we can have modernity and the amphitheater, but it can all be never larger than 2/3 the size of the nearest redwood tree. And I take, Elizabeth, your book as, in some ways, a challenge, not a happy one, but a realistic one to that way of thinking, an admission that if we want something even close to the world we've had, we are going to need to change the world quite dramatically. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about that tension.
Sure. I'm gonna start. I know we've heard a lot of thank yous, but I'm gonna add a few more. I want to thank you, Ezra, for coming. Ezra has recently decamped to Brooklyn. He didn't tell you that, but it's very kind of him to be here. I want to thank the Humanities Institute and the university and of course the Deep Reads program. It's really, really. Oh, and the mayor for calling this Elizabeth Kolbert Day. That is definitely a first in my career. So the book, as all of you know, or many of you know, is really, I think, a challenge to, well, I guess I would say everything. I mean, to two strains of which I think are the dominant narratives in our culture right now, as we face really, genuinely, I want to say genuinely unprecedented problems in the history of humanity. And one is, as Ezra said, the idea that we can go back to something, we can, all live, 8 billion of us in some kind of harmonious relationship with nature if we only, did X or Y. I think that's one narrative. It's one that I am emotionally myself very attached to, but I don't think fits our moment anymore. And the other dominant narrative is technology is going to save us. We're going to have some, deus ex machina that will be a machina, actually, and it will save us. And the book is really an attempt to sort of come at both of those, critique both of those narratives, really, and say what is really going on here.
I want to start in the book by having you tell the story of the relationship between Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and the Asian carp.
Yeah. So the Asian carp, once again, as you all know, play a pretty starring role in the book. They're really several species, a big character in the first chapter, which is about the reversal of the Chicago River and how that set in motion this cascade of environmental consequences that people didn't really understand. And one of the major consequences is, opening up this pathway between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. And Rachel Carson comes in a very interesting way. If you all have read Silent Spring recently, or maybe even in the distant past, you may remember that the last chapter is called The Road Not Taken. And The Road Not Taken is a hopeful look at what we could do to replace pesticides, these pesticides that she's very, rightfully condemning. And The Road Not Taken involves biocontrol. We're going to use a biological agent to, if we don't like something, we have a pest, we don't like it, we're not going to, try to kill it off with chemicals. We're going to try to introduce a natural predator. And it's a pretty interesting, idea. It's very widely used. We use all sorts of biocontrol, but we also have many, many examples, unfortunately, of biocontrol having gone awry. And the Asian carp are a very good example of that. They were brought in for various forms of biocontrol to eat invasive weeds, to help with sewage loading, nutrient loading, and they got loose and they've wreaked environmental havoc. And we have many, many examples of this. And it's actually quite interesting because Rachel Carson was quite smart, obviously brilliant, wrote all about the web of nature, but kind of had a weird blind spot about the dangers of moving species around like that.
But I think a lot of us do. So I just love the parable of the Asian carp, and as I will now forever refer to it. And one of the reasons is that it gets at something that I think many of us fall prey to pretty easily, which is a conflation of organic and natural, right? That there is a category difference between intervening with something that is artificial. When I was growing up, I could eat like the worst food you could imagine, but it couldn't have artificial colors in it, right? Like that was the line. And I think that's an intuitive thing for a lot of people, and has been a within the DNA, the non-genetically modified DNA of the environmental movement. So how do you think about that intuition? Where does it make sense? Where does it not? What does it get that's right, and what does it get that's wrong?
Well, that's a sort of a $1 trillion question these days, and I think that the word natural gets thrown around a lot, like we're going to use nature-based solutions, for example, to climate change, and we can certainly talk about that. I think that one of the points of Under White Sky is that we are so implicated in nature these days that it's very, very, very difficult to draw the line between what is ourselves, whether you want to call that artificial or human or natural. That's kind of, a semantics, which obviously as a journalist I'm very interested in semantics, but it becomes almost a semantic question. And the question of, what is a biological agent, right? We are all biological agents, but we would not describe everything that we do as natural. If we do, the word kind of loses its meaning. I mean, is your iPhone, natural? It's hard to really make that case, I think. But once again, where we draw that line, we could, for example, in the case of climate change, and you're going to hear a lot of conversation about this. We could grow stuff, trees. We could, chop them down and sink them to the bottom of the ocean, right? That would take carbon that the trees had sucked up, and it would then, preserve it basically in these logs that are now at the bottom of the ocean. Is that natural? I don't think most of us would say that that's natural, but it would be kind of labeled a nature-based solution.
I'd never thought of doing that.
Well, you're going to be here.
I'm processing that possibility as we speak. Being a human being in this age is weird. One thing that I learned from the book that I think about quite a bit is the insight into human civilization that we get from ice cores. Can you talk through that bit of research?
Sure. So ice cores, all an ice core is it's a basically, you set a tube, you stick a tube with pointy teeth, you drill with this tube down through the ice core, and we now have really long ice cores from Antarctica, which go back almost 1 million years now, and we have ice cores from Greenland, which go back about 100,000 years. All these ice sheets are just layers of snow that were laid down year after year and never melted. And they contain a tremendous amount of information. It turns out very smart scientists, some doubtless here in Santa Cruz, figured out how to read these as an archive of the climate and of the atmosphere. And what we learn is that the last ice age, right? So humans, let's say we're around modern humans, anatomically modern humans are around 300,000 years old, let's say. So we've been around for a couple ice ages. But the last ice age, we learn from these Greenland cores, which are very, very detailed, was a very climatically unstable time. And people probably couldn't really settle down because the climate changed too often. And then all of what we think of, all of the cities that we have, all of what we think of as the great civilizations of history fit into this 10,000-year period since the end of the last ice age, which was a very unusually stable climate, and irrigation and farming were invented during that period. And I think there's increasing consensus that that's no coincidence.
I want to read a quote from one of the scientists you speak to there, who kind of raises a question of, look, human beings have been around a long time with very similar cognitive hardware to what we have today, to use the metaphor of the moment. And he says, they had just as big brains as we have today. Well, he's asking the question, why did human beings not make civilization then 50,000 years ago? And he says, quote, that they had just as big brains as we have today. When you put it in a climatic framework, you can say, well, it was the Ice Age, and this was so climatically unstable that each time you had the beginnings of a culture, they had to move. Talking about the human beings, then, as you say, comes the present 10,000 years. Tell me a bit about, I think that there is an ongoing sense that human civilization is built on a very stable foundation. And maybe at this point it is in a way it wasn't when it was just starting out, right? It could have been a more fragile flower at the beginning, and probably was. But what is that relationship? When you worry about a climate awry, what do you worry about at the civilizational level?
Well, I think that, and once again, I should sort of preface this by saying, as a journalist, I go out and as you will be familiar with, Ezra, you go out and you talk to a lot of people. So I should say all of these ideas are not, they're not me coming out of this, out of my head. I think that what people who really, really know the science would say that they're worried about is, we have a society now. We have an unprecedented number of people on planet Earth. We recently hit 8 billion, a population of 8 billion people. And we are dug in ways that we weren't previously. And the notion that you have a very broad base for civilization is, absolutely true. But we also have certain brittleness and certain vulnerabilities that come with these very, very complicated systems that we live off of. And if you think of something as, ordinary as a, big storm that knocks out the electricity, and how we cannot function right now, without electricity, how our societies can't really function. And then you start thinking about the possibilities of cascading climatic crises, I think it brings you to worries not about, the end of civilization, but the worries about the vulnerability of these very, very interconnected societies. And once again, you could point to several. I mean, there are people, obviously, right now, as you've written about, Ezra, people worrying about AI. You could worry about many ways in which a completely globally interconnected society is on one level very robust and on another level very vulnerable.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to ask that is that when I got into journalism in sort of professionally in 2005, it felt like the solution space on climate change was fairly unformed. Like maybe we'd have a climate tax, or maybe there'd be a lot of efficiency and everybody would wear sweaters and we wouldn't drive SUVs. And now...
It hasn't worked out, has it?
Yeah, it's a lot of SUVs, including in Santa Cruz, I notice. Try telling people they should eat less meat. They don't like to hear that. So now we've settled, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, if you look at what other countries are doing, at an all-out race to, now the term is decarbonize, right? And decarbonization in practice means we are going to build solar arrays and wind arrays and geothermal at a scale that, until I began looking at this, I did not understand this, but the scale of land use we are talking about here is unbelievable, right? If we really want to live the level of energy intense lives we do on a decarbonized grid, we are talking about turning over a landmass the size of many states in every country, right, over to this kind of energy. How do you think about that? Because that means that far from conservation, decarbonization means probably the single fastest transformation of land in human history.
Well, I think, and this once again is not a brilliant insight, but I think it's huge, and it's going to be one of the defining debates, I guess you could call it, or developments, of the next several decades. And these decisions are going to be made. They're going to be made on a case-by-case basis. Do we take, this desert, as it were, and just turn it into a solar array? Do we take that offshore, mount and turn it into an offshore wind? And there are going to be a lot of trade-offs there. I don't think that we can deny that, and I guess that is another, in a way, theme of, under a white sky. There are no easy answers. There are no simple, straightforward, this is what we do and everything will be fixed answers.
Well, I want to talk about one trade-off in particular, because I read, and we did a show together, and I was very influenced by your book, The Sixth Extinction, which if you found Under the White Sky a little too optimistic, sunny, didn't leave you feeling sufficiently grim, you might enjoy The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. And one thing that is already playing out in a lot of efforts to build these big wind and solar arrays is habitat destruction. And you have environmental groups that on the one hand are terrified of climate change, see climate change as a genuinely existential threat to human civilization, and on the other hand are actually fighting wind farms and solar panels and for a reason, right? Because you have to turn over a lot of land. You have to destroy forest land. You have to carpet the desert in solar, and then you have to run all that energy through new transmission lines around. And my colleague David Wallace-Wells has written about this, but there's increasingly a tension between two parts of the environmental movement that for a long time I think people understood as aligned, which is the part that is working on climate crisis and the part that is increasingly terrified of biodiversity loss. And you've written definitional books on biodiversity loss and climate crisis, and I'm curious how you have been tracking and understanding that collision of goals and before the collision of goals of means.
Well, I can even further talk about, this gets into some, pretty interesting, we'll call it interesting territory, and it gets back to, so there's, just sheer habitat destruction. There's all of the mining that we're going to have to do, for electric cars. People talk about mining the bottom of the sea now to get at the kind of elements that we need, rare earths, things like that. And then if you add into that, people talk about, nature-based solutions. Now, often these nature-based solutions, which involve things like, growing trees to suck up carbon, they also take up a tremendous amount of space. A lot of space that will have to be devoted, for example, to tree plantations, which are not the same as, the forest that was there. So we have a huge array of complexities here. And, are we going to, this is really the question of our moment, are we going to thread our way through all of these in a way that at the end of it, many humans are still here and many other species are still here? That is kind of the question that will be answered in a way, unfortunately, for better or worse, over the next, century.
One of the notes of the book is towards a deep humility, though, that even if we think we have an answer, we really have it. I mean, I take that as the story of the Asian carp, but all throughout, there's a skepticism that when trying to alter a system as complex as the Earth, and in many cases we were trying to alter much simpler systems in the stories you tell, that human history is an endless procession of both progress and profoundly unintended consequences. You talk about the problem of control, but can you talk about the problems of knowledge and prediction?
Well, I think that, one of the things that we're seeing is that our technological abilities, often outstrip our wisdom, to be honest. I guess I'll call it wisdom. Maybe that's an antiquated word. But we need to be, I do think if the book is an argument for anything, it is really an argument for a very deep humility, which is tied into a very deep, skepticism. If someone, is advertising something as a sort of silver bullet, we should be probably pretty skeptical about that. And we should be mindful of intense consequences when we do anything at scale. And that is sort of what we're talking about, right? Scaling up. That solar array on your roof, okay, that's one thing. And the solar array that takes up an estate is sort of doing it at scale. So I think that, what is the, answer here? I don't have that answer, I guess, is the problem. But I think that we do need to be a lot more careful than we have been. We have sort of been conducting this whole Earth experiment, the results of which I don't think we're going to care for.
And this is I think my favorite part of the book is a disorientation between these two arguments, because you hear that, and some of the stories I've told here so far, and it's a story about the limits of the human capacity to reliably affect the world we live in. And I think the natural tendency would be to assume the moral is stop, don't go further. And I also don't take that as the moral of the book. I'm trying to decide which of these quotes I want to use. In many ways, I found the book as sort of leading up to one of the single greatest quotes I've read in any book ever, which is from Andy Parker, the project director for the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, which is a more boring title than. And he says to you, "We live in a world where deliberately dimming the fucking sun might be less risky than not doing it." And when you say we should be more cautious, we should be alert to the limits of our wisdom, on the other hand, there's this pressure throughout the book. You tell the story of the proliferating cane toad, which is a poisonous toad that everything loves to eat, and then they die. But maybe you can use gene splicing or gene editing to edit the poison out of the toad, but if you've just completely changed this entire species of toad or ended malarial mosquitoes, like how do you know what else you've done to the ecosystem? And you write there too, the strongest argument for gene editing cane toads, house mice, and shiprats is also the simplest. What's the alternative? So there are three pressures here. There's we don't know what the hell our interventions are actually going to do. There is if we don't do them, disaster is going to result. And there's also the question of speed. Climate, unlike a lot of other things I cover, is overwhelmed by the question of speed. You have to do it fast, or so much carbon built up in the atmosphere and greenhouse gases that then your interventions have to be that much more violent because you're digging out of that much bigger of a hole. So I recognize I just keep sort of posing the same question to you of how do you resolve, but you're the one who wrote this book. I didn't do this to us. So.
Okay, I plead guilty and I deserve it. I think one of the quotes, and I'm unfortunately going to mangle it because I didn't bring it in writing, but one of the quotes that sort of was in the back of my mind as I was writing this book was a quote by a guy named Paul Kingsnorth, who wrote a book which I would recommend. It's called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, and he says something like, "I'm not sure in this time anyone really has good answers, but I think we can raise some good questions." And I'm going to, plead good questions as opposed to good answers. If I had the answers, Ezra, I definitely would have written a different book. I would have, honestly, probably be a lot more powerful person than I am today. If I
It's
had...
Elizabeth Kolbert Day in the city of Santa Cruz, I'll have you know.
Good point.
It's not named after anybody else here.
Good point. Well, on this one day, so I do realize that that's an unsatisfying answer to the big questions of our time, but it's the only one I can offer. I don't think there are clear answers. I do think there are grades of bad answer. And unfortunately, one of the lessons of the book, as you pointed out, is that we're not even sure necessarily in advance what those are going to be. We can only do the best that we can. And as our tools become more and more powerful, we're seeing this all the time, that our tools outrace ourselves. I keep alluding, I know that this is a new for all of us, and it's something that you've written about very eloquently, Ezra. AI definitely outstripped our ability to deal with it, and now you have a lot of scientists out there saying, we need better governance on this because this is, gonna outstrip what we have right now. And we see that over and over again. Our tools outstrip our ability to even think about these technologies, and that obviously raises the stakes. But on the other hand, what we have at the same time, and climate change is just unfortunately one example, but a very good example of how we are already changing the planet without intending to, and we don't have any choice but to react to that at this point. And how are we going to do that? And I was just, walking along, the cliffs in Santa Cruz this morning, and I see, all of these plans to, rebuild up there. Does that make sense? These are just decisions that we're going to keep facing over and over again.
Is that for rebuilding in the cliffs, or wondering if it makes sense to rebuild in the cliffs? You wrote something that I hadn't noticed when I read it the first time, but I'd wanted to ask you about this time, which is that we've become the prime drivers of extinction. I think people know that, but also potentially of speciation, which I don't think is as commonly said or known. So tell me about that.
Well, we moved a lot of things around the world. Asian carp, are just one of, I guess, literally a zillion examples of that. And when you do that, when you move a species, and it's particularly true that if you move something, to an island, it becomes isolated, it becomes reproductively isolated. So, for example, to just use an example, we've moved rats and mice all around the world. They're now, rats on uninhabited islands, but that, people landed in ships and left rats behind. And they will, over time, become reproductively isolated and quite possibly speciate. And in the sixth extinction, I do talk about speculation. Once again, it's not my speculation, but, that we will get new species of giant rats, that will be like our legacy in evolutionary history because we have left rats really, literally everywhere.
We did it, everybody. Sorry, I will say that actually threw me for a second. This is, I guess, a big question. But it's something that within this conversation I wonder about a lot, which is we're a pretty unusual species, even in the way we look at ourselves. When we see a beaver build a dam or a bird build a nest, we don't go and say, aha, you've polluted this landscape with your artificial construction. But we have this very interesting, and I think poisonous in kind of both directions, separation of ourself from nature. And I think usually when people say that, what they mean is that we don't understand our kinship with everything, and our, that we are an interbeing with like the sun and the trees and it's true. But we also see everything we do as unnatural, right? When you were saying our legacy will be the rats, well, no, in a way. Our legacy will be, hopefully not just legacy, but the ruins. Like, if you were here in 1,000 years and we all left, obviously a lot would grow over this amphitheater, but if an alien landed, it would be a fascinating, it would become part of the landscape. This is all made with material that at some point originated on planet Earth. And I can't help but think there's something strange in this, and our inability to see our own success as also a kind of success of nature. Life has this desire to reproduce, to grow, and it has created all these strange wonders. And now, yes, we're in a different world, but it is a world created by the urges and the potency that is in everything else. And there's something in the alienation we feel from that I wonder if it's also not part of our inability to reckon with it, to try to control it, to try to think wisely about it, that we sort of do it but also hate it, and so can't actually sit with it.
Well, I think there are a couple ways to get at that question. The first off is, if beavers, and beavers are, very, very, we have a beaver dam around the corner from us, and it's an amazingly impressive structure. And if beavers were, suddenly redoing the entire planet, they would have a big impact, but they are, restricted as to where they can build their dams. And that, I think what distinguishes humans is not just our reach, not just our global reach at this point, but we at some point did take a different turn from, I think I can say this without fear of contradiction, every other species with our technologies. And those started out as pretty simple by our own reckoning, but they already had very big consequences. Human hunting, when humans, started to spread around the world a long, long time ago, many tens of thousands of years ago, we can see these waves of extinction. Because when a species has new technologies that other species are not equipped to deal with, they have only evolution, right, to deal with your new technology. But we can change our technologies very quickly. And that just puts us in a different position vis-a-vis the other species of this planet. And that has consequences, we are finding out.
But I think I'm asking something slightly different, which is how human beings understand themselves and their technology and its relationship to nature. So something that has been obsessing me because it's part of a book I'm writing and I'm trying to think about, and it's true for as we think about AI and anything else, is there are definitions of human beings. They're the animal, they're the technology-mediated animal, right? There are people who say that is what we are. And again, that does not mean we are not natural. Our technology is not natural. It is an alteration of the world, and I'm not arguing that it's not of a different type of scale and consequence, but it is, we are a natural creature, that this is what we do on some level. But what we don't seem to me to have is a thoughtful relationship to that, like almost a religion of our own technology, a way of theorizing what values should inform it, what its relationship with the world around us is. And to me, this is what this book is a little bit about. You can talk about the problem of control as a problem of wisdom, but it's also a question of values. I noted this kind of glancingly and as a just way of proving that I have lived here before, but the Santa Cruz decision to not have any buildings, at least as I understood it when I was here, higher than 2/3 the size of the nearest redwood, is a techno-philosophical decision. It's not to not have buildings, but it is to have some kind of relationship between the buildings and the world around them. And so I'm curious how you think about that. You sort of absolved yourself of responsibility for beyond the questions here. I know we don't have the answers, but there is a question here, because we do need to work with our technology to both create the possibilities and to work through the problems that the future brings. This book is fully you sort of touring around people working through that. What philosophies or relationships to human technology and the way they think about it in the world appealed to you? Who was eloquent? Who was inspiring? Who do you wish? Who would you say, if we were turning to people for answers, they had something in their values that pointed towards an answer?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I met a lot of people while reporting the book who I think were really, really sincerely, very sincerely trying to use technology to either minimize or correct for problems that technology was causing. Now, a theory of technology that really allowed us to work through our relationship to the natural world, would be devoutly to be wished for at this point. And I think it really gets back, in a way, to your point that you mentioned earlier about how, now we could try to, we will try to decarbonize, we will cause other, major impacts. And the question of whether there are technologies, there was a lot of talk in the 60s, Buckminster Fuller, we're going to dematerialize. We're just going to dematerialize the world. We're going to, do everything that we do, but our material impact on the world is going to shrink. And that is, I would say, has not turned out to happen. Why not? Even as we move, onto the web and things are virtual, our material impact on the world continues to grow. How can we, is there a way forward where we do have actually, where our technologies, are there technologies where we actually have less of a material impact on the world? And I am really not, a technologist, but I think that's a huge question. And when we look at things like moving into the next generation of technologies, and we are confronted once again that this thing that arrived, this electric car, let's say, which we hope will be a solution to one set of problems, that it carries this huge trail of other consequences. I don't know if we can get out of that cycle. I think that is, once again, a humongous question.
Who, when you were talking to the book, because it is a book of characters, who sticks with you? Whose words echo for you as you think about these questions and continue to confront them in your reporting?
Well, the book really began sort of in the middle when I went out to Hawaii and spoke to a woman named Ruth Gates, who had envisioned this project, this super coral project, where we're going to breed up more resilient corals. And Ruth, sadly, very tragically died quite young, just a couple years after I met her. But her words, which had really set me on this whole journey, I often think back to that, this first conversation that I had with her in a Korean barbecue place in a strip mall in Hawaii, about how, going back, a lot of people, she was fighting against, this project was very controversial. It was this idea that, we've screwed up the oceans, we've screwed them up so much that we're going to have to, intervene in some way if we want reefs. That's very controversial. A lot of people don't think it's smart to even be talking that way, because you're not getting reefs back if you have to manipulate them. Reefs are just huge. They're whole ecosystems, and if you think that humans can do that, you're probably wrong, and you're maybe deflecting attention from the real point, which is to save the oceans. So it was very controversial, but her point was, we don't have any choice. We're in this too far. And so I often think back to Ruth. Once again, I don't know that she had an answer, but she was asking some pretty interesting questions.
Thank you so much for that ending. Speaking of asking some pretty interesting questions, I have here in my hand some pretty interesting questions. And if you thought I was pressing you for solutions, wait till you hear these. So I mentioned a minute ago my favorite quote, both in the book and in life, of what if we now live in a world where it is riskier not to dim the fucking sun than to dim it. One thing that can obscure is that it is more and less risky for different people in different places to dim or not dim the sun. And I think this question speaks to that. Quote, if we have record high temperatures in the next 5 years, how long do you think it will be before India or some other nation takes unilateral action like reflective particles in the sky?
Well, I mean, that's on one level, a question that I can throw back to you all. I don't have any particular insight. That is actually, for those of you who have read, The Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, that is how it begins, that India has a terrible heat wave, and they unilaterally decide to do geoengineering. I am less concerned about that because I think that it requires geoengineering, which is this idea, we're going to spray something reflective in the stratosphere. It doesn't require buy-in from everybody, but it requires buy-in from everybody who has a very strong Air Force, right? So I don't think that, if the US doesn't want India to do that, I don't think that will be, practical. How's that? But a small group of very powerful nations, could do it. And it raises a lot of questions, obviously, because one of the many fears about geoengineering is that it will change regional weather patterns and that it will mess with the monsoons. And these are, very real fears. And actually, Andy Parker, who is the guy who is the originator of that quote, he is actually one of the people working on, ensuring that people, scientists in this case, from all parts of the world, the global north, the global south, do have input into those, are doing research on precisely these questions, because it will affect different, or could affect different groups of people very differently.
This question is from Abby. For Elizabeth, it's very formal. There are underlying tones that capitalism is one of the root causes for the sixth extinction, yet it isn't explicitly stated in that book. What was your intention in this approach, and how was that approach further examined into Under a White Sky?
Read me the first part of that again.
There are underlying tones that capitalism is one of the root causes for the sixth extinction. So, but it isn't explicitly stated. So I read this question as saying, is it true that capitalism is behind the sixth extinction? And isn't it true that capitalism is behind a lot of the issues in Under a White Sky? And if both those things are true, why are we pussyfooting around capitalism?
I think that is a good question, a very good question. I think that, we can go on some level, even deeper than capitalism, I suppose. We have to, I think that capitalism, which has brought us to the point we're at right now, is clearly, unbelievably significant. Now, the question is would we have arrived at this point of a technologically, very advanced culture with very high consumption habits, without capitalism? Would it have taken us longer to get there? Would we never get there? Would we have a totally different set of values? These are questions that are very, very difficult to answer. But I certainly think that it is possible. People often ask me, is it possible that we can deal with these problems without dealing, with the underlying economic forces? And the question that I think is really, really urgent is, which is harder to do? Change our underlying economic system, or change our way of doing things with the economic system that we have? And I don't have the answer to that, and I don't know whether we can solve these issues, with the current economic system, and I don't know if we can change the current economic system. So these are all, once again, huge questions that everyone will have to decide.
I'd just like to note that 15 minutes ago I felt pretty negatively about dimming the sun, but now its wisdom is becoming more apparent. How do you see the role of the land back movement in the effort to combat climate change? On top of asking the right questions, are we asking the right people, particularly indigenous communities?
Well, there was just a really interesting study that came out that talked about, how land managed by indigenous communities in all sorts of measurements, including, climate change, we would be much better off if the world were handed, much of the world were handed over to indigenous communities. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom to that. But I think we also have to, look at ourselves. To be honest, we are once again, we are 8 billion people. We have to feed 8 billion people. We have to clothe 8 billion people. And the question of whether we can do both of those things simultaneously, whether we could hand back a lot of land that has been, stolen from indigenous people, and at the same time, meet the social goals, which I think many people here would also want us to meet for everyone else, is really, really, really tough question. But I do think that indigenous communities probably do have a lot to teach us.
A topic beyond your book is whether there is political capacity to implement the kinds of policies you needed to address the climate crisis. Do you think there is? And if not, then what?
Well, I think one of the interesting questions of our time, which people, will look back on with either knowingly or in astonishment, that, and this is also a topic you've written about a lot, Ezra, and I commend Ezra's book. I know that many of you have read it, about polarization, why we are polarized.
That's for tomorrow on Ezra Klein Day.
Yeah. That we are facing these incredibly difficult problems that would be incredibly difficult if our politics were functional, that we happen to be facing them at a moment when our politics seem to be heading, we're now deciding whether or not we should even, pay our debts, okay? Where we seem to be at a moment of perhaps not maximum political dysfunction, but since the Civil War, perhaps maximum political dysfunction. Is that a coincidence? Will it look like all of these things were interrelated? They just couldn't cope with, the situation they themselves had devised. Now, living through it right now, I don't really think that Donald Trump was elected because of climate change. But when you look back at it a century from now, will it look like, there was just some big unraveling that was going on? And whether our political institutions are capable, I'll say very simply, I think the answer is no. They are not capable at this moment of dealing with these problems. And the consequences of that will be very severe. I'm willing to answer that.
So that then brings up this question, and I think you're going to want to I know you well enough to say I think you're going to kind of want to not answer this, but I'm going to say that for most of my adult life, you've been one of the 4, 3, 2, 1 most important communicators on climate change to the American people. What is your recommendation for convincing the American people that climate change is real and must be addressed now? And I'm going to slightly sharpen that by saying, or asking on top of it, in your experience, what kinds of arguments work that are not made, and what kinds of arguments are made that do not work?
Well, that's a super good question, and critically important. And once again, people have devoted their lives, and probably there are also people at Santa Cruz, people doing research on why we can't move this conversation forward in this country. I think one of the things that has changed, you can say for better or worse, since I started writing about climate change, which is, getting on 20 years now, is people see the consequences. They see it in their own lives. What is happening on the Colorado River, what is happening in coastal cities, you can argue about, the underlying causes, which is ridiculous, but we can still argue about it. We manage to still argue about it. But people see in their farms and in their businesses that things are changing and that they have to deal with that. So I think more and more Americans are realizing something's going on. Now, you still find people ascribing it to different causes, which doesn't make it easy to deal with. But I think that unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, nature, as it were, is doing our work, is increasingly doing that communication work for us.
I want to ask the second part of that question, though, again. What kind of arguments do you find that people in politics, people who care about this, want to make that don't connect? You've written a lot of pieces. You know what? Journals have a sense, and you're a great storyteller of what kind of stories work and don't. So nature is one of our, is communicating, to some degree, but there are a lot of other people communicating. And what kind of arguments do you wish you heard fewer of?
Well, I think one, the refuge that you have, that I hear all the time when I go out and talk to people. I went out last year, for example, and I just talked to people at Hoover Dam. So you're looking out over Lake Mead, which is only a quarter full, and even after this year's very heavy snowfall, it's still only a quarter full. You see this huge bathtub ring around it, and you ask people, what do you see? When you look out at Lake Mead. And half the people that I spoke to, I don't know if I did a random sample or not, half the people were, I see climate change. I see a very scary future. I'm scared for my kids. And half the people are, I see a cyclical thing. It's a drought. Droughts come, droughts go. Ice ages come, ice ages go. It'll all turn around. That's just the way the world works. And is that an argument? It's not exactly an argument, but it makes it very difficult to move forward when half the people are saying this is just going to magically or naturally turn around, and half the people are saying we really need to look very seriously at the trend line here and acknowledge that it's not going to turn around. So I don't know how you address that problem.
Before I ask this next one, can I have another tranche of these, if such things exist, of questions, not just index cards, which I actually don't need on their own. As a UC Santa Cruz student, how can I make I actually like this. There's concrete, and then concrete is scratched out, presumably because it's a huge contributor to climate change. So if that was intended, good on you. As a UCSC student, how can I make a change?
Well, this is another really, really good question, and we are in California, which is, in its own way, really a leader in many ways on trying to deal with climate change. So I think there are obviously two dimensions to any one person's impact. One is what you do in your own life and the example that you set in your own life, and there are lots of ways that we could all obviously do a lot better, but as many people have pointed out, there's always a limit to what one individual can do. And so once again, I'm not saying anything terribly original, but political action is crucially needed here, and support for politicians who take what are still, even in California, pretty courageous stands, is still probably the single best thing that you can do. And another thing I would also say, I don't know, politics on UC politics, but I think that students have more power than they know, than they realize, in terms of campus life and what is considered to be acceptable and what is not considered to be acceptable. And we need, certain behaviors to be considered unacceptable and certain behaviors to be more and more acceptable, I guess. And as a student, I think that influencing, starting with campus politics is probably a pretty good place to start.
Let me ask you, while I'm waiting for the index cards to come, about a place like Santa Cruz. This is a really very beautiful place. It's a very special place. And it's a place where, like, in my soul, my desires to build on everything, so there's affordable housing, and never build anything ever again, are really put to conflict. And this is not also a very sustainable place, to be blunt about it. Thank you. There's obviously the kind of building on eroding coastline. There is the way in which not building more dense, affordable housing in a place like this pushes people out into, like, the urban wild interfaces, pushes out sprawl and commuting that people here then get to say, oh, I live this wonderful, localist lifestyle. But it is pushing others into something very different. You go down to Watsonville, as I was talking to some students here today about, and you have pesticides being sprayed everywhere, not just on food, but on people. What makes a place like, what are the tensions in the responsibility of a place with the ideals of Santa Cruz, but that is very attached to the lovely life it has built for itself?
Well, these are also, these are really hard questions. As someone who is obviously, I'm not a Santa Cruz person, but I've only been here a few times in my life. It's a spectacular place. I totally understand why people love living here. I live in I wouldn't say the East Coast equivalent. There probably is no East Coast equivalent, but I live in a kind of also rural, place that prides itself on its own, green aesthetic, but also is probably exporting a lot of its problems. And I think that, one of the great questions, and this is maybe one of the great questions for capitalism, and I've been sort of mulling this over lately, is if we internalized the externalities, if we actually, when people talk about a carbon tax, it's like, should we internalize the external costs of our carbon pollution? And if we had an economic system where we actually internalized the externalities of everything we were doing, including the pesticides we were putting, on somewhere else, could that, what kind of lives would we lead? And that's a very abstract question. I'm sure there are economists in the audience who would tell me that's either ridiculous or impractical or perhaps brilliant. But what would that be like if we really had to, put our money where our mouths are? And I think it's an interesting question and potentially an interesting, experiment.
That's a bridge to this question, which is, wouldn't it be better if, when we talk about what we can do to reduce carbon emissions, we stop saying we as in human beings, and we started saying we as in the US and other high fossil fuel producing and burning human beings?
Well, I will say that I think when we say we, or when I say we, I do mean we in the US. There are many people in the world who are producing, trivial amounts of CO2 every year, and we are not among them. No one in this audience today, and certainly I include myself way up there, are very high producers. And so I think that in sort of climate circles, it's understood that the big emitters have to stop emitting, and the small emitters, eventually, because they would probably like to, everyone would like to be using more energy, not emitting more, but using more energy, because that is very much tied up in modern life with, quality of life or standard of living. How's that? That also they should take a different path towards energy use, but I think it's clear that it has to be the high emitters who go first.
That could be a question of nations, and it can also be a question of individuals. Hence this question, which is, how do you think about airplane travel? If you have the privilege to be able to afford it, do you swear off using it to shrink your carbon footprint? Do you balance it somehow? It is notable that Santa Cruz is having a deep read about climate and decided to bring in two people who had to fly here to get here, and we both did. What about us?
Oh, I think that's a very legitimate question. I struggle with it a lot, but I am here, so you could say, I came down on the wrong part of the struggle, and that would be a legitimate criticism. So I don't have a good answer to that. I used to say, well, if I fly across the country, I hope I will have made it worth those carbon emissions. But I'm not sure that that's a sufficient justification.
After speaking to so many confronting these issues, this challenge, what have you, I think it's quite beautiful, what have you learned about the human capacity to both grieve and imagine at the same time? What makes that into a creative relationship?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think one of the great privileges of being a journalist and being able to go out there into the world, both into amazing places and with a lot of people, different people from different backgrounds and all sorts of different walks of life and philosophies, is to sort of realize that the human is unbelievably multifaceted, and maybe that is the most hopeful thing I can say. We humans are capable of intense love, intense self-sacrifice, intense greed, intense destruction. All of these are all true simultaneously, and the choices that we make, which are both individual choices and collective choices, as to which of these elements of ourselves will prevail, which we're all making every single day, is what makes the job interesting, and I guess you could say what makes life interesting, and also both beautiful and terrifying.
This will be the question we end on. But we here in this event, and also possibly we, humanity as a species.
Right now?
Well, it's a big question. You mentioned earlier the way in which our technology is outpacing our wisdom. What are practices, what are institutions, what are approaches that you believe could help our wisdom catch up to, or once again, outpace our technology?
Wow, I'm probably not the right person to ask this question, but I will try to take a stab at it. I mean, as I say, I talk to a lot of people. I plead journalism. I don't have a worldview that I can offer. I think that an organization like the Humanities Institute, an organization like UC Santa Cruz, which has a lot of very smart people working on a lot of interesting problems from different angles, shows I guess I do believe, at the end of the day, as a humanities major, I do believe that we are capable of, thinking things through in ways that we don't often do. I still believe that there is an idealized capacity for reflection and thought, and even wisdom. It's not a spiritual practice that I can explain, or it doesn't have a name, but I do believe that we are capable of many different ways of living, and the more we can imagine many different ways of living, and the more we come in contact with many different ways of living, probably both imaginatively and in practice, the better off we'll be.
I'll add one thing to that as we end, which is, having spent some years here and always trying to come back here fairly often since, I do think there's something different to the privilege of being inside trees like these and in a place like this often. I think it changes your thinking. It always changes mine. So to those of you who get to do it all the time, I hope you take that wisdom it gives you and do something with it. This is a special place that reminds you that special places should be honored. Thank you to the Humanities Institute, to Elizabeth Kolbert, of course, to UC Santa Cruz for having us. I think someone is going to come and say what happens next, but very much to all of you for participating in the Deep Read.
Thank you.